Hello, everyone. It's my second time on the hot seat, and I am going to get it right this time. My name is Clifford. I'm a developer advocate here at Grafana Labs. This session is all about alerting today, but first, I would like to introduce you to my co-host once again. Oh, that way.
Yeah. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Nicole van der Hoeven. Good job, Jay, remembering your name this time. Today we have over here George here to talk to us all about alerting. This is actually Jay and me asking all the Loki questions to George. Alerting is something that's super confusing, and George is going to be he's actually in a pretty good position because he used to be on the alerting team. So we're going to be asking him some basic questions about how to do alerting on logs and all the different methods for doing alerting. But first, we have some announcements. First is that Jay and I are both speaking at KubeCon in London in April. So that's really, if you are going, then why don't you check us out? Do you want to talk about your thing, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, so this is with my colleague Tom. We had a lot of fun with this. So essentially, what we wanted to do was teach people about the different telemetry signals in observability and specifically about open telemetry. So we made a text-based adventure game to teach people how to use each of the telemetry signals, logs, metrics, traces, and eventually profiles. So we'll be playing a live game at KubeCon on stage. So quite excited for that.
And I'm going to be talking about Asimov's zeroth law of robotics, of observability for AI. I am a huge Isaac Asimov fan. He had the three laws of robotics, and I'm going to propose law zero, which is that a robot must be observable before we know whether or not it can rise up and kill humans. But that's good. That should be fun. I'm going to be tying in AI and AI observability and testing. So if you're going to KubeCon, come see both of those talks, as well as six other talks by Graphanistas. So pretty well attended from our side this time. We've also got Loki 3.4, which just released. That's kind of relevant to this. Um, Jay, did you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, Loki 3.4 was a solid release. It actually included basically the new Thanos API. We're basically trying to unify the object storage API across the board. So it now works alongside Mimir, Pyroscope, and Loki all now share the same object storage API. There's no need to move to it just yet. It's pretty easy to configure in your Helm values files and into your Loki config. It's just something to consider in the future. It makes things a lot more easier for us to maintain going forward, having sort of a unified API to work on. So thank you to the Thanos maintainers for doing all that work on the API. It's made Loki, Mimir, and Pyroscope better DBs because of it. So it's really good.
And we've also got GrafanaCon in May. This is the last one. If you'd like to go to GrafanaCon, then go to this link. It's grad.fan/con, and you can still sign up to go to it. The CFPs have closed. I'm not sure exactly who's going to be there yet because they haven't released who is going to be speaking, but it is one of the most awesome conferences because it's all community based and everyone there is like a super user of some Grafana or multiple Grafana projects, and it's quite unique in that normally when I'm at the booth, I'm the like Grafana person that people are asking questions to, and in this conference, everyone knows a lot more about Well, not everyone, but like these are people that really use Grafana stuff heavily. So I learned so much just by going. But why don't we jump into our topic for today? Let's talk about George. George, what are you doing here? How long have you been working at Grafana?
The hot seat, George, the hot seat. Tell us about yourself.
Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. Yeah, so my name's George. I'm a software engineer on the Loki team, but I've been at Grafana Labs now for, I think this will be my fourth year, or the end of my fourth year. And I spent the first 3 years of that actually on the alerting team. before I joined the Loki team. So I was hired in on the Loki team. But I've been using Grafana now, I think, because I was thinking about this the other day, I think it was 2016.
Serious?
I think 2016. And at the time, I was working as a SRE, and we were using the tick stack, which, for those people who don't know, that's Telegraph, InfluxDB, Capacitor, and Chronograph. But we used Grafana as our visualization tool. So we were using InfluxDB and Telegraph. Telegraph is like the agent. InfluxDB is like Prometheus. But we were using Grafana to do our dashboards and stuff like this. And I've been using Grafana ever since 2016, every job I've worked at. And now I work at Grafana. So it's just a natural progression.
And you've also got some fans in the chat, George, as well. So literally was like, Grafana is lucky to have you, George. So the appreciation and love is already in the chat.
Oh, that's very kind.
So today, alerting. I must admit, I'm gonna break the cardinal rule here and say I am terrible at alerting. I feel like with Loki, I do a lot of querying, I do a lot of ingesting, but when it comes to alerting, I have no idea. So I think like the cool thing would be to break it down to its basics, and then we're going to build it up, talk about the different components, litter in all of these. We've actually, I must admit, thank you to everyone who put in questions. We've had like the most amount of questions from the community on alerting. So clearly it's a big topic for you all. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. But let's talk a little bit about the basics first. Can you tell us exactly what an alert is in Loki?
Sure. So an alert, or even just beyond Loki, an alert is essentially a rule that is continuously evaluated at a frequency or an interval that you choose. And it's looking for a condition. And when the condition is met, the alert fires. And the idea is that you can have a sort of continuously running query where you get to set the parameters of when does this fire? And then when it fires, the idea is that the alert lets you know that it's fired. So it's a complete hands-off way to know about problems without having to be continuously monitoring for them. I.e., you don't have to have your screen on 24 hours a day watching a dashboard just to see if a graph spikes up. The alert takes care of that for you. It runs autonomously in the background. And then it lets you know there's a problem rather than you having to go yourself and check if there's a problem. That's like a very basic high level.
So we're like being proactive rather than reactive. It's like we're getting our notification first.
Yeah. But the computer is doing the proactivity. You're not.
Yeah.
You're reactive in that sense.
Yeah, this is why I sometimes hate the term observability, because it makes you think that the goal is for someone to be constantly watching. I don't want to be watching. I think that's pretty crappy if there's a system that you have to be observing all the time. Alerting is the thing that really frees you, because you don't want to have to babysit it. You want to just be told when things go wrong. And that you really can't do any good observability without the alerting part of it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And so, okay, so alerting's one side of it with Loki. There's also another notion of recording rules. Could you tell us what we'd use recording rules for? What are they?
So recording rules have, well, I think they have a couple of use cases. The most common use case people think about is essentially saving the result of computationally intensive Loki queries. So for example, you're running aggregations over our windows or lots of data, and this can be quite slow. You obviously have to read a lot of data. And if you're running in Grafana Cloud, your build, if you read too much compared to what you write, for example. So recording rules are a way for you to take frequently used queries, say you might run these queries every day, or they might be feeding dashboards that you look at all the time, you can take those queries and you can essentially save the results as a Prometheus metric. So when you then come back to load that dashboard, it doesn't have to run the really expensive query again on all that log data. It just loads the intermediate result from Prometheus. It can be much faster. It can save you a lot of money. So you really just benefit. But you can also, it's also beneficial for alerts as well sometimes. If your alerts are running very intensive log QL queries over large time ranges, well, they can also be slow. You want to make sure that your alert query is relatively fast, because if the alert query takes longer than the alert evaluation interval, say your alert's meant to run every minute, but the query takes 1 minute and 30 seconds, well, then the rule's going to fall behind because it takes longer to run it than the frequency it's meant to run at. And then you might miss things.
So can something be a recording rule and an alert?
So in general, the way it works is you use the recording rule to calculate the metric that you want to alert on. And then you have an alert rule that uses the result of your recording rule. So if you like, the recording rule feeds into the alert. So you've got your Loki logs, you calculate some metrics with your recording rule, and then you alert on those metrics that your recording rule has just produced. So it's like a chain.
It's pretty cool. And then, okay, and then so that's basically, you would obviously we're really getting into the weed of it here, so I'm going to extract us back, but we can definitely get back to this with the recording rule part. So I guess sort of bringing us back, what actually handles all of this in Loki? What component of Loki handles both recording and alerting rules?
Yeah, so it's the ruler component. The ruler is an optional component in Loki, but you don't have to download another piece of software. It's included in the Loki installation, whether you run a single binary or whether you run a Docker image, whether Docker Compose or you run it from a Helm chart. It is included in the Loki software suite, if you like. And the Loki ruler runs both your alerting rules and your recording rules. And the actual way you define alerting and recording rules is almost identical. In the actual YAML that you write, it's almost identical. And you specify a group, and a group contains a series of rules. For each group, you say how frequently I want the rules in this group to be evaluated. And then you specify a list of rules that are evaluated in that group. Something that people miss, I think, a couple of times is the rules in a group are all evaluated in series, sequentially, one after the other. So it's like a list. It goes rule 1, rule 2, rule 3, rule 4. So rules in a group are not evaluated in parallel, but groups are. So you've got to be careful. If you've got an alert rule that depends on the recording rule and they're in different groups, you can have situations where the alert rule is evaluated first before the recording rule. So its result is not ready. So often it's important to put the recording rule and the alerting rule in the same group, so they happen
Sequentially after each other.
Sequentially, yeah. And then the output can be ready when the next rule runs.
Dang. So, and that's sort of like the dependency chain going down. I didn't realize that. That's actually really good to know. So evaluating group, keeping it so groups are triggered parallel depending upon timings, but anything inside a group sequentially is run in that group.
So there is a real quick question I just want to answer. Someone asked, can you use the result of one recording rule?
Yeah, well, let's read that out loud. Yiri Rolicek says, can you use the result of one recording rule and use it as a part of a different recording rule?
So the answer is yes, but in Loki ruler, no. And the reason for that is that the Loki ruler queries logs. So when you have a recording rule in Loki, your input is logs and your output is metrics. So there's no way to do like a recursive rule where because Loki recording rules don't output logs, you can't then use the output of a recording rule in Loki as the input to another recording rule. But in Mimir or Prometheus, you can. So once your recording rule has been exported to Prometheus or exported to Mimir, you can then use the output of your Loki recording rule as the input to a Mimir recording rule, if you really wanted to. In Mimir, you can do this. In Prometheus, you can do this because everything is metrics. But a Loki recording rule actually translates logs into metrics, which isn't the case in Prometheus or Mimir, where you have the same input and the same output. It's both metrics. It's not translating it between logs and metrics. And that's what is different about Loki recording rules, is they translate logs to metrics.
So I feel what would be good, and especially for me as well, is do you think we could kind of like, because the next sort of question we have for you is sort of like, how does an alert manager tie into this? And we've talked a little bit about, you know, using recording rules and putting those into Prometheus. You could sketch out a bit of a diagram of these components and we can just sort of see sort of how these all, a bit of lay of the land.
Yeah, sure. So I have a tab open. We can switch to that. Okay, let's get drawing. So you would like to see how the ruler fits in with the alert manager and like the data sources. Should I also include Grafana at this stage or just keep it with Loki ruler? Do you think?
Yeah, go for it. I think, and then like, especially, we talked a bit about recording rules there as well. So if you want to add, say, like a Prometheus component in there, that would be great.
Yeah, alert manager.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's really confusing. It's like there's so many, it feels like there's so many different ways to do alerts. Like what should we be using? I don't know.
Sure. So let's get drawing. So we've got, I'm going to draw this big box as Loki. And obviously inside Loki, you've got all your little components, like your querier.
Can you use a bigger font size?
I think I can. I can also, oh, it's quite small, isn't it? Let me zoom in. I'll have to zoom in and out every, I think, a little bit. But you've got your querier, you've got your ingesters, or ingester. And you've got, I haven't drawn everything because I'm not going to run out of space, but you've got your ruler.
Yeah.
And here you have like your store, and this is where your logs are kept. This could be Loki, could be a local disk. It could be cloud storage bucket, like an AWS S3 bucket or a GCP bucket or an Azure bucket. And your Loki ruler actually queries the store and indexes directly. It can use the querier, but by default it doesn't. By default, it actually has its own querier. And the ruler goes and it gets all the rules you have and it evaluates them one after the other. And it will get logs from the store and read the indexes and compute. If it's a recording rule, it will compute a result. And if it's an alert rule, it might fire an alert. So with recording rules, once you have the output, you can then send them somewhere. You might want to send them to Prometheus. Prometheus is a time series database. You can send it to Mimir and I think a couple of other backends. It doesn't have to be Prometheus and just Mimir. And then what you get out of this is metrics. And in your recording rule, you'd specify what the metric should be called. You can then, well, if you're just looking at recording rules, you can then use the metrics you've got from the recording rule and you can combine it with other metrics you've got from somewhere else. Say, I don't know, your agent. And you can write alerts also in Prometheus or also in Mimir. So you could, because Prometheus has a ruler as well, you can then do alerts like this. So you can use the output of your recording rule in a Prometheus ruler. But you can't do it in a Loki ruler because the Loki ruler only queries logs. But you can do it in a Prometheus ruler. So you get the output of your recording rules in a Prometheus ruler. And then you can combine it with other metrics to alert on those. If you go back here and we look at the Loki ruler, or it can produce alerts. And then this together combined goes to an alert manager. So you can send all your alerts, whether it's from Loki, whether it's from Prometheus, whether it's from Mimir, to a single alert manager. So the job of the ruler is to evaluate rules and either produce metrics if it's a recording rule, or to produce alerts if it's an alerting rule. The job of the alert manager is not to evaluate rules, but it's to receive alerts and then group them together based on your configuration file in your alert manager. And the idea of grouping is you can take hundreds or thousands of alerts and reduce them to a much smaller number of notifications. Because if you've got 1,000 alerts firing, you don't want 1,000 Slack messages in your channel. You don't want 1,000 phone calls from PagerDuty. You want to reduce them into something meaningful that says, hey, these systems are down, take a look. And that's what Alert Manager does. It will take all these alerts, it will then pass them through all your routes, which you define yourself. It will separate them into little groups. The font's getting very small now, but you get the idea. Imagine these are your little groups. We'll color those. And then from there, each group will send its own notification. And that can be to Slack, it can be to email. Any of the supported receivers, basically. And in addition, you have other features like silencing, inhibition rules, active time intervals, mute time intervals. We can talk about those in a little bit as well, if you like.
So, I mean, I think this actually sort of relates really well to a question we just had in, just because you've got the architecture, and you mentioned about how the ruler has its own querier, or you can route the ruler through the querier. Is that sort of the two modes? So Nicole was asking, what's the pros and cons of each way of doing this? And it would be great to sort of get there's been some answers in the chat about it, but it'd be great to see what you think about this as well, George.
Yeah, so Andre is pretty much totally correct. So when you have rulers with their own querier, you can horizontally scale the rulers, and they will shard the rule evaluations by group, not by rule, but by group. So one ruler takes these groups, another ruler takes other groups. So you can sort of shard the query load that way. But like Andre says, you won't be able to take advantage of caching. You won't be able to take advantage of things like query splitting and query sharding, where the query and the query front end can take your complex queries and then split them even more amongst other queries. So because you only have a single ruler evaluating a rule, without the query and the query front end, only that ruler can evaluate that query. It can't split them any further than that. But by getting a ruler to use the query front end, it can then subdivide the work even further and parallelize it. So if you have a very...
Sorry, go on.
Oh, if you have a very expensive query, a slow query, you can parallelize it and speed it up. On the other hand, that's also a great use case for a recording rule, because if you have a slow query, you might be able to cache its results intermediately using a recording rule. So you have a bunch of different dials you can turn when you're writing your alerts. You've got recording rules as a way to essentially avoid having to run slow queries in the first place, or run them less frequently. And then you also have the scaling of the query or the query front end. So that's what you would do. And in general, when we recommend people to use a query with their rulers, we actually recommend that they set up a separate set of queries, independent of their dashboards. The reason we suggest this is because alerts and recording rules are time sensitive. Your dashboard isn't as time sensitive. If the query takes a little bit longer to show on the panel, it doesn't really matter. But you want your alert rule queries to be running with the highest priority. And essentially the easiest way to do that is to give them dedicated queries. And that's what we do. That's how we run it.
Oh, interesting.
I just wanted to say that Andre is who answered the question, is one of our Grafana champions.
Yeah.
So totally awesome that our champions are in the chat as well. Jay, did you want to say something?
I just thought that was super interesting. That's what we did within Grafana Cloud when we host Loki, is we actually have dedicated queriers for our rulers that we are basically, we route all of our traffic through. I didn't realize, I guess for the sheer scale of our Loki deployment, that makes sense. So we're always making sure that we hit people's alerts on time. But yeah, dang, that's really good to know.
We have
So
another question from, well, another answer from or comment from Syncroy, who I think your name is Carla, if I'm not mistaken. This is an answer or comment to Hervé's question. For me, the pro is that my querier load depends on my users. So having the ruler querier avoids a noisy neighbor problem in my experience.
Yeah, so I think if I understand correctly, this person's just having the ruler do their querying so they can avoid noisy neighbors on their queries from affecting their alert rule evaluation. So that's why I recommended potentially having a separate set of queries. It's another way around that noisy neighbor problem. But it also gives you the scaling advantages of splitting and sharding.
And Hervé adds, and recording rules can generate a lot of S3 traffic and end up being expensive, hence the usefulness of the cache. Syncroy also asks, so is it running a separate set of querier pools so the ruler forwards its rules?
I think I just answered that because they've also said yeah, but yes, like you're running a
Yeah.
separate set of queries, a separate pool just for your rule evaluation and your recording rules. Yeah.
Okay. We also had a few questions earlier that I want to get to. Suleiman, also a Grafana champion, yay, asks how does the ruler work with multi-tenant Loki SSD or distributed deployment modes? I could not find the proper configuration to define two tenants in the Loki ruler config.
How does Ruler work with multi-tenant Loki SSD? I'm not necessarily sure I actually understand that question. I'm not super familiar with Loki SSD stuff. In distributed deployment, I can't find configuration to find two tenants in the Loki Ruler config. Well, the way we do it is the tenants interact with a Loki Ruler via their own basically per tenant API. In terms of config files on disk, I don't know off the top of my head. If that's the way you're doing it with config files on disk, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I thought that it works. If you're doing the SSD or the file system-based rules, you have a folder per tenant, and then you have the files in each folder. So you would have like rules / tenant one, and then in each folder you would have all their rules. And then you would have rules / tenant two, and tenant two would have all their rules in there, and so on. I don't know if I've misunderstood your question.
I think George, so SSD, I know unfortunately is like simple scalable deployment, and they've just sort of like condensed the name. So I think it was just the idea of, so that if we've got like, say, I know tenant production, tenant dev, like they basically want to understand, is there a way of like configuring rulers to work with specific tenants? So if we have like, how do we do it in our own cloud setup when we have multiple tenants interacting with
to configure rules with specific tenants? I don't know off the top of my head. What I do know is we basically, for us, we don't dedicate rulers to specific tenants like that. We just use the standard sharding mechanism where rule groups are split across different ruler replicas. And if we do have noisy neighbors, we just tend to scale up the rulers. And sometimes the queries, yeah.
Nice. Hopefully that answers your question, and we can definitely follow up afterwards to look at a ruler config. We can I'll add that to my backlog. The cool thing about this call with George is what we're doing here is everything that we're aggregating here is our plan is to rewrite the alerting part of the Loki docs. So this is like our initial call to get all of this information out there. So thank you guys for asking the tough questions to George, because that helps us out in the process. So I guess sort of taking it back, Les, we've talked a lot about the ruler and its configuration and setup. If we sort of jump back up to the sort of bubble back to alerting and recording rules once again, let's sort of talk about alerting first. What are some of the issues that you see people doing in their alerting? What's it, if a bit of a war in the trenches when you've worked with customers or seen community members, what can go wrong in alerting and what should they be doing to change it?
Okay, so I think one very interesting problem we see, and it's not something people think about to start with, is what exactly are you alerting on? What do you want to know from this alert? It's very easy just to set up loads of alerts without really thinking about it. But remember, usually an alert is there to page you. It's usually there to tell you something, and something urgently. So my advice always is, when you're setting up alerts, sort of take a step back. Like, you want your alerts to be relevant. You want them to be in general specific and actionable. So by relevant, I mean, like, you should be alerting on something that is important to you or to your service. Specific, I mean, like, say you have an alert that just says HTTP error rates are elevated. Well, where are they elevated? Is it in an API somewhere? Which API? Which service? Which endpoint? How long has it been elevated? So you get a lot of information early on before you start investigating. And then the other one is actionable. You need to have an alert where, when it fires and you get paged or you get pinged, you need to be able to take an action based on that alert. If you get woken up at 3 a.m. with an alert and there's nothing you can do about it, it's meaningless. Like, how is that valuable to you or to solving the problem? So when you're setting up an alert, think like, what is this for? What does it mean when this fires? And what action am I going to take when this fires to solve the problem? And if you can't really answer those three, oftentimes it shouldn't be an alert. It should be in a dashboard somewhere, and you can go check it the next day. Once you've decided that this needs to be an alert, and you've got your, you know what you're going to feed into it, there's a couple of things that I think people, I don't want to say mess up, but sometimes misunderstand, or it's a bit vague. So one of them obviously is the evaluation interval. We did see a lot of cases where people want to have the lowest possible evaluation interval on their rule. Like, they want to evaluate the alert every 10 seconds, every 5 seconds. But they weren't sending us data every 10 seconds or every 5 seconds. So your evaluation interval is only as useful as your scrape interval or your collection rate. And this applies a little bit more to metrics than it does to logs. But if you've got recording rules, it's still relevant, because your recording rule might run only once a minute. So it's only giving you one metric per rule, depending on the cardinality, per minute. So evaluating the alert every 10 seconds gives you no additional value, because you're only getting new data points once a minute. But then you're querying everything every 10 seconds, and you're paying that cost of querying every 10 seconds for nothing. So evaluation interval is important. A good sane default is usually once per minute. And that usually matches people's scrape intervals of 15 seconds, where you send metrics to us every 15 seconds, or your agent sends logs to us every X seconds. You usually want to be a multiple of your data ingestion interval, your scrape interval. And 4 times is generally considered a sane default. The other one is the for duration. And the for duration says how long after the condition has been met for my alert rule, or rather, how long should the condition be met for the alert to fire? I.e., the condition shouldn't be met just once, but it should be continuously met for a certain number of minutes, say 5 minutes. And the reason for that is you don't necessarily want to alert on a small blip. Something went wrong for, say you had elevated error rates for 10 seconds, and then everything returned to normal. That's not really a good alert, because you don't want to be paged about that. That's an example of an unactionable alert, because there's nothing wrong. You might have just had a small blip. Maybe there was lock contention in your database or something like that caused a very small blip in latency or errors. But right now, there's nothing for you really to do, and it's not worth being woken up about.
So this is like alerting fatigue, is kind of like you just receive too many alerts for the sake of.
Exactly. And it will fatigue you, and then you will start to discount them and be like, oh, it's just that again. But
And you're like,
it's like
what
the
was the
boy who
point?
cried wolf. And when it actually counts, you're going to look at it and go, oh, it's just that alert again. But this time it really matters and something's actually broken and you need to look at it. So the 4 interval is a great way to avoid or prevent sort of overly eager alerts, overly sensitive alerts. So don't be afraid to set that to something like 5 minutes. You know, like if this has been broken for at least 5 minutes, something's wrong. And don't forget, you might be evaluating your rule just once a minute. So that's 5 evaluations continuously where the condition has been met. And that's usually quite a sane default. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depends on what you're monitoring. But those are usually pretty sane defaults. Another very common one is labels versus annotations. So in the whole Prometheus ecosystem, and Loki's based on Prometheus at the end of the day, alerts have labels and they have annotations. The difference between the two is labels are sort of like a primary key, if you're familiar with databases. And they are key value pairs that essentially become the alert's ID. It's like unique key, it's unique name. So you don't want to put highly dynamic data into a label. For example, the result from a query. Because every time the rule runs, you'll make a new alert, but it'll be for the same problem. So say you've got crashes and you're alerting on crashes, but you include the whole logline in as a label, and that logline will have a timestamp. Well, every time the rule runs, you're going to make a new alert. So you're going to have lots of duplicate alerts for the same problem. So that's an example where you don't want highly dynamic data in your labels. And that happens a lot where people try and put the value in their label because they want to get the value out of the query into their notification. A great place for that is annotations. Annotations are structurally identical to labels, but they don't form the ID. They don't form the part of that primary key. They're descriptive. So for example, you would put your summary in there. And the summary would be a piece of text you write when you define your rule that says, this is what the alert means. This is what it means for this to fire. And usually it's about a sentence long. And you'd say something like, HTTP error rates on this API have been elevated for more than 5 minutes. And then you have the description, which is sort of a longer piece of text. And in that you sort of write what this alert means, and then what you can start to think to do about it, right? So labels are sort of the unique key, and annotations are sort of the descriptive part of the alert. And annotations are a great place for summaries, descriptions, like links to runbooks, links to Grafana Explore with the query. So you can have an alert that fires, and then you link it to a Grafana Explore page, and then you can click it, and you can see all the log lines from that alert, rather than having to try and force them into the alert.
So I think that kind of answered a question that we had from one of our community members preloaded, which was how to include log lines. I don't know if we got it here, Nicole, Andreas, Jago, how to include log lines into alert notifications. Maybe just a few samples about modifying or complicating alert conditions. But I'm assuming that's the best practice here in itself is you should just be creating like an annotation that's a good description and then linking out to somewhere that contains that information rather than trying to push that all inside an alert message.
Yeah,
like
that's what I recommend today. The reason for this is because what you have to remember in Loki is that Loki alerting is actually on time series data. It's not on logs. So it's like, it is Prometheus in that sense. It's Prometheus for logs. And Loki was always, the slogan was always Prometheus for logs. So your alert rule is not actually on logs. It's on the time series data produced by the query, produced by the logs. And that's where it gets really complicated to put things like log lines in there, high cardinality data. What I recommend is sort of what I said is create your alert, write good summaries, write good descriptions, and then link to a logql query in Grafana Explore, where you can then go and see the logs. If you really, really have to, you can try and extract parts of the log line as a label, but you have to be very careful about having highly dynamic data in that, because you will end up with hundreds or thousands of alerts. Like every time a log line gets produced that matches that query, you'll get a new alert, and you'll end up with thousands or hundreds of alerts coming in. You don't want that. But we also understand that this is a popular feature request, and we are thinking about ways for you to do this in future without running into the problem of putting it in labels, because it's clearly beneficial to users to be able to get a notification and just see a sample of the log lines rather than all of them, because you could have thousands, right? And that's not going to be useful to you, but at least a sample where you can see, oh, okay, here's the line in the file where the crash happened. I saw that last week, and you can immediately become familiar with the context rather than having to go into Grafana Explore. So we are thinking about it, but today I would say try to avoid putting log lines in your alert for that reason.
We also had a question from Andre that I want to make sure we get to. Andre said he would really like to use the recording rule, but he has a delay receiving logs. He uses AWS ALB, application load balancer, so they get pushed every 5 minutes. So that means that he has to use an offset, and then the metric ends up with a wrong timestamp.
So that's great, because I actually thought about this earlier before we joined. So for you, I think it sounds like the offset modifier would be great. And the offset modifier says each time the rule runs, you can actually get the rule to look further back. Normally it looks at the current time, and it says what's happened in the last, say you got something for the last 5 minutes, it starts at the current time and then works back. But if you've got a 5-minute delay on your logs, you want to shift the current time back. You want to shift the window back because you've got a 5-minute delay. So every time the rule runs, you don't want to look at the current time, but you might want to look at 5 minutes ago because you've got a 5-minute delay. And the offset modifier is great for that. The offset modifier lets you change that window that the query is looking at from now to sometime in the past. And by doing that, what happens is your recall is sort of lagging behind real time, but it's lagging behind real time just enough for those delayed logs to come in and to be ingested. So when the rule runs, the logs you need for that time window are there now. So it's constantly lagging behind real world time a little bit, but not too much. And then you actually get to run your query against the logs that you want it to. And if you look at the documentation for LogQL, you should find it under offset modifier.
Okay, and there was some discussion in the chat as well about using Grafana Managed Alert Manager versus Mimir's Alert Manager. And Hervé Nicole was suggesting to use Mimir's Alert Manager just for the multi-tenancy purposes, so that you only need one alert manager. I mean, can you shed some light on this?
Sure. Would it be good just to also give some high level context about the differences first, and then we can go into that question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
That was
please.
one of the topics I think we were going to talk about. So in the Grafana ecosystem, you have Grafana managed alerts. And we abbreviate these a lot as GMA, Grafana managed alerts. And then you have data source managed alerts, we call DMA. Grafana managed alerts are alerts that are managed, stored, and evaluated within Grafana. So your actual Grafana installation has the alerts, it evaluates the alerts, and then it sends them to an alert manager. In data source managed alerts, the alerts are stored and evaluated in the data source. And that might be Mimir, it might be Loki. Data source managed alerts kind of predate Grafana managed alerts. Grafana's always had an alerting suite, but Grafana managed alerts are quite new. It was the product I was working on when I was in the team. But there are a couple of things to consider when choosing between them. And the answer kind of depends a little bit, depending on whether you're using Grafana Cloud or whether you're using open source. So for example, Grafana Managed Alerts has its own alert manager built in. So if you just want to deploy one application for all your alerting, you don't have to deploy a separate alert manager. You don't have to deploy any of that. Grafana Managed Alerts has it all built in. So you just install Grafana and it's up and running. That's obviously not the case with Loki, because you need the Loki query, you need the ruler, and then you need an alert manager. Grafana Managed Alerts also has a number of features that are not available in things like Mimir and Loki. So for example, you can have role-based access control, the alerting state history feature. You've got screenshots of dashboards and panels when an alert fires. You can obviously join data across multiple data sources. So your alert query can actually query 2 different data sources at the same time. You've got some other features like pausing and resuming of alert rules. And then obviously you've got the really tight integration with like Grafana Incident and Grafana On-Call. Until recently, Grafana Managed Alerts didn't support recording rules. But this is coming. I spoke to the team, this is coming. And they're expecting it to be available in Grafana 12, which is this year, right? So that will make Grafana Managed Alerts almost feature complete with data source managed alerts. Now, the only exception is if you're using Grafana open source, an important factor here is that the open source Grafana Managed Alerts doesn't have things like horizontal scaling and sharding of your rules, where the Mimir and Loki rulers do. So if you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of alerts in your OSS or enterprise deployment, then running Grafana Managed Alerts can be a challenge. And what you would probably have to do is run separate installations of Grafana Managed Alerts and then split your rules manually yourself across the installations. But with data source managed alert, the sharding is taken care for you. But that's not true in Grafana Cloud. So in Grafana Cloud, the horizontal scaling of Grafana Managed Alerts is taken care for you. It's just the OSS product where that's not possible. And obviously, when you use data source managed alerts, you can still use Grafana as your UI. There's nothing to stop you using the Grafana UI to manage those alerts in Loki, in Mimir. All you have to do is just add it as a connection in the connections tab. So those are sort of the differences. Should we go back to the question and then we can follow up on that question? Which one was it?
Yes, so the question was whether or not they should use Mimir's alert manager for multi-tenancy or the Grafana managed alerts, because Andre was saying that he uses Grafana managed alerts.
So Grafana managed alerts doesn't have the concept of tenants as such, but it has the concept of organizations. So you can have separate orgs, but also within Grafana managed alerts, you have role-based access control. And I'm not completely familiar with the ins and outs of role-based access control, but I would imagine that would mean that even though you don't have tenants, you can restrict which users can see which rules. So even though it's technically a single tenant, the roles in that access control system let you separate who can see what and who can do what. But if the tenant system in Mimir works for you, then great. Like, don't change it. Like, there's no need to change it unless you really want those features from Grafana Managed Alerts. And if it works for you today, stick with what works with you today, you know.
Yuri also says Grafana Managed Alert Manager does not support inhibition rules, amongst other things, which makes it the biggest argument for us to use the Prometheus Alert Manager.
So I know the alerting team is aware that inhibition rules are not supported right now, because it's something we talked about when I was on the team. I do think they are planning to add it because it's on their issue board, but I don't know when. In Grafana Cloud, I believe it's coming very, very soon. In Grafana OSS, again, it'll take a little bit longer because the way they're going to implement it is slightly different. So they'll have to do something for cloud and something else for OSS. But I do believe it's coming. If you really want to use Grafana Managed Alerts today with inhibition rules, you can point it to an external alert manager. So you would still use Grafana Managed Alerts, but rather than using the built-in alert manager with Grafana, you would run your own Prometheus Alert Manager. And then Grafana would send its alerts to the Prometheus Alert Manager instead of using the internal one. But then you could use your inhibition rules if you wanted to. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's possible, is possible.
Okay. We have another question from a community member, Matt Brown. Is anyone aware of what might cause Loki recording rules that you define in Grafana to disappear? Is there a way to recover recording rules?
So I saw your question earlier, Matt. The thing is, if they disappear, it would suggest to me they're not loaded in the ruler, because that would suggest that they're not being returned by the rules API. The rules API in the ruler basically says, give me all the rules that you know about that you've loaded. If it's not in that API response, like you can't see it in the Grafana UI, or you can't see it in the Loki rules API, or you can't even see it in Loki tool, it suggests to me that they're not registered. The question is then why? If you're using like the local SSD rule backend, they should still be in the file system somewhere on your disk. If you're using one of the like object storage backends, it should be somewhere there. If they've been accidentally deleted, I don't think there's a way to recover them. But if that hasn't happened, they should be there somewhere, but for some reason they're not being loaded into the ruler.
So George, could there be like a weird limbo? So like I'm thinking about like this from like, say you've got like your ruler tied to object storage and like an S3, and that's where you're saving your rules. And then you're using the ruler API in order to like push new rules into the ruler. Could there be a period where the ruler acknowledges the fact that it has a new rule and it's within, say, the permissive memory or the WAL of like its function, but because they've got a problem with their object storage, that rule is not being propagated into S3 for whatever reason. And if the ruler restarts or kills it, like it could potentially lose the rules, or is that does the ruler need to have them hit object storage before it starts?
Yeah, I think if my memory is correct, I think the ruler essentially commits it to object storage as part of the upload stage. So if it cannot put it in object storage, I think it should reject it and return an error. I think.
Okay.
So it shouldn't be able to. It shouldn't be able to go missing in that respect.
Yeah.
We can check that. But I'm pretty sure it's been built that way. So
that was my only thought. It's like how do they disappear if not? Because yeah, I couldn't think of another reason, except for someone's gone in. One of his colleagues has gone in there and deleted them all.
What a troll.
Colleagues.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question. It's a troubleshooting type question. Okay, well, it's going to be difficult to show in one thing, but I will read it out. From Sitilge, I'm trying to figure out why my Loki setup isn't running recording rules and not sending the resulting metrics to the Prometheus remote write endpoint. So the rules don't get added to the /rules directory by the sidecar container, but I don't see anything related in the logs of the Loki container in the Loki backend pod or the Loki SE rules container, even after enabling debug logging for both. Any ideas on how to troubleshoot this?
Yeah, so I was actually looking at your specific problem this morning. I had some free time this morning and I was looking at it specifically. So if rules are being evaluated, you should see debug log lines for evaluating rule. They'll literally just say evaluating rule. If you see this, but remote write isn't working, then I would start to look for problems with remote write. If you don't see the evaluating rule log line, I would start to look for problems with the rules being loaded in Loki. So I did find a bug report about this, specifically related to the Loki sidecar rules container. What I had time to test this morning, someone mentioned in that issue, is that what they thought is the rule is being loaded and then the sidecar container is running and downloading the rules. So what I checked this morning was, is the Loki ruler discovering rules that are written to the file system after the ruler has started running? And that I can confirm is working. So even if the files are created after the ruler has started, it does pick them up, which is what I expected, because that's how it works with object storage, right? You know, you're going through the API, you're putting stuff in object storage, and then it's syncing them from object storage and then loading those rules into memory. So that bit worked. What I haven't had time to look into then is, if that bit works, what is the interaction with the sidecar? Why is it not working with the sidecar? So I think it seems to me that you're not the only problem, not the only person who has this problem, because the issue that's being linked 11508. So I think we need to look into that to make sure there's not a problem there, because it doesn't necessarily seem like you've done anything wrong. It could be a bug, and we will look into that, I think, and get back to that issue. So follow that issue for updates. I should have some time tomorrow maybe to have a look at it in more detail, and we can look into
Oh
it.
wow, committing to things
There we
live.
go. I mean,
That's brave of you.
I've never used the sidecar before, so it's good. It's good to get some hands-on experience.
Okay, we have another question from Peter Corliss. Shouldn't there be a revision control system that would allow you to look at the rules? Yikes.
And essentially, you're looking for sort of version control, aren't you?
Yes, I think that's what he means.
Inside Loki, I don't think there's any revision control. What you can do today is, if you provision your rules as code using Git and then some kind of CI/CD system, is an excellent way to do that. That's what we do for a lot of our infrastructure alerts. They're all managed in GitHub, and then they get published via a CI/CD pipeline, and it works great. And then we can see the history of the rules. We see you changed them, obviously, but then we can also lock out people from manually making undocumented or unauthorized changes to rules. They have to go through the pipeline. Their changes have to be approved by a colleague, and then everything after that is locked down. So I think it's something we can definitely consider, but for now, if you really need this now, that's what I would recommend, and it works great for us.
Yeah, I think that probably isn't as much a Loki question as much as it is just like
best
a
practice.
process or best
Yeah.
practices. GitOps is your friend on that one. We have another question from Pikili Saikiran. Hi team, I've been using ruler evaluation mode as local and also tested remote using the query front end URL. Having pros and cons with both, what would you recommend for us to use?
So I think we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier when we talked about when you might want to use the query front end with query splitting and sharding versus just using the ruler. I mean, a really good way to understand if your ruler is not being able to keep up with its workload is, and you've already scaled it to some degree, is to look at metrics for like rule group evaluations missed, and it will tell you whether rules are being essentially they're falling behind, they're getting delayed because the previous evaluation took too long. And you can go and look at the query and be like, oh, actually, I can optimize this query. And then you can sort of defer the need to use external queryers. But sometimes if your query needs to look at large time ranges, then that's when something like the query front end is really great, because you can split the query over that time range and get different queries to process little chunks at a time, feed their results back, and then you can compute it all together. So you're basically breaking up the work. So that's what I'll be looking at, things like missed evaluations. Is your ruler running out of memory because it's trying to read too much log data into memory, do aggregations on them? And is it getting oomed? Is it getting killed by your process manager, right? So things like that.
Are any of those included in the Loki mix-ins, or is that something they should go pull for to sort of monitor those specific components of the Loki metrics?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. It sounds like a great idea if we haven't already done it. It's in our documentation. I know that because I checked it.
Nice.
Whether it's in the mix-in, I'm not sure.
I'll have a look. Okay, that's cool. That's a to-do list for Jay.
I can find that doc as well on scaling the ruler real quick. And we can put it in the chat.
Sweet.
Another question from Nicole. Any advice on tools to check Loki rules within a CI/CD pipeline?
Can you like expand on what you mean by check? I think you mean something specific, but I'm not understanding.
I think this was basically what we was talking about earlier about how you guys in the team basically to approve new rules going in, you use Git to basically sync rules up into approve new rules in, and someone has to check them. How are you guys currently going about that method?
The way that it actually gets provisioned, I'm not 100% sure because it's mostly managed by a platform team. But what I do know is obviously it's in a file. Essentially, it's in a YAML file. It's reviewed by colleagues, and then we use Tanker, which is like our configuration language and sort of management system. And from there, it goes, I think, goes through GitHub Actions, and it gets pushed essentially to our infrastructure. But it's mostly taken care of by a platform team. So I don't know the ins and outs of exactly how we do it. But that's sort of the big picture. And obviously, you don't have to use GitHub Actions. You don't have to use Tanker. You can use loads of other tools, but the big picture is sort of the same. And even if I wasn't, at Grafana Labs, that's probably how I would do it if I was working somewhere else and then setting that up, because it's just a great way to do it.
Love it. So I guess, Nicole, do you want to do your favorite segment where we quick fire the last of the questions with George?
Oh, can I quickly jump in because Nicole mentioned. So if you're using, to check the syntax is valid, if you're using the Loki rules API, that should be validated for you, I'm pretty sure, when you push the rules. It shouldn't let you save an invalid LogQL alert or rule. If you do it file-based, it will fail to load. It should fail to load. And the feedback mechanism is a bit more asynchronous in that respect. So you might have to look at metrics and logs. So the rules API is a great way to do that. For Prometheus rules, use Pint. I'm familiar with Pint. I wonder if Pint even works, because it is the query language is very similar between Loki and Prometheus. And if it doesn't work directly, you could probably fork Pint, because there's not a huge amount of difference between LogQL and PromQL. Okay, cool. So Mimir tool and Cortex tool handles that. I would expect Loki tool to handle it too. Yeah.
Okay, so just a few quick ones. I've been going at it and hacking away at them already. I think we already sort of talked about this one, but let's mention it again. Syncroy, who had to go, but he might watch the recording, had a question about the alerting in multi-tenant environments that he mentioned earlier. He said, I run Loki ingesting logs from multiple clusters. Each cluster is identical, but hosted in different zones or regions, and each one has a tenant ID. And at the moment, I need to create one alert for each cluster, so 20 clusters, because the ruler component doesn't support multi-tenancy. Are there any plans to support multi-tenant queries in the ruler component?
So I saw your question earlier before we got started. It sounds like you've got different tenants for each cluster, but it sounds like it's all your, like, there's not separate customers of yours or separate teams. It sounds like this is all your stuff. So in general, tenants are really meant to be isolated from one another. Like, think of them like customers, think of them like teams. They should never be able to see each other's stuff. So there's quite a strict level of isolation. And if you don't need that strict level of isolation, I don't think you actually need different tenants for each cluster. We don't do that, for example. So then you can have a single alert rule that just the LogQL query aggregates by cluster. So you have a single rule for all your clusters, and you just aggregate it by the cluster, which is exactly what we do for our internal monitoring. So yeah, I would consider actually having one tenant for all clusters, unless there's a really strong need for the isolation between them. And if you do need that strong isolation between clusters, you could then look at provisioning the rules using something like Loki tool, or again, a CI/CD pipeline, where you manage it in Git or GitHub or wherever Git hosting you're using. And then you have a list of your tenants, and you publish that rule every time you make a change for all tenants automatically. So even though you have the rule replicated per tenant, you only have to change it in one place once. and then your automation takes care of the rest. So that's probably what I would advise for that.
Okay. Couple more quick ones. Might not be able to get super into it because we're already a little bit over, but I still wanted to address it a little bit. Yuri Rolicek says, is it possible to perform aggregation queries like sum, count over time on labels extracted from metadata? I was unsuccessful when attempting it this week.
Is this is structured metadata, I assume?
Yeah, I
I
think
believe so, yeah.
I must be very honest. I am not super familiar with querying structured metadata. So my honest answer is actually I don't know. I would suggest asking that potentially on the community forum, or we can find out and get back to you. We can ask someone in the team who would know and get back to
Yeah,
you.
you should be able to just using metric queries, but maybe it would be useful to show the actual query that you're using and what you mean unsuccessful.
If you're querying, I might have misunderstood the question as well, because you're not trying to just do a sum or count over time of the metadata, but of the logs identified by the metadata, right? And in that case, you should definitely be able to.
Yes.
If you're, because just aggregating the
Yeah.
metadata itself doesn't necessarily make sense to me. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I
I
think
know.
that's what he means. But
I
yes,
think,
more
yeah,
information maybe in a community post.
yeah.
Last one. Tomek Dabrowski. Are all alerting rule settings available through the Grafana UI also available as configuration as code in Terraform? For example, setting an SNS contact point.
Okay, so SNS I think is only in Grafana managed alerts. I think. And Terraform only works with Grafana managed alerts. There are some community providers, by the way, for data source managed alerts, but they're not maintained by Grafana Labs. If the Terraform provider is not up to date, then SNS may be missing, because I remember it was added when I was still in the team, but it was about a year ago. So if the Terraform provider is not up to date, it will be missing. Usually, when features get added in alerting, then the Terraform provider gets updated afterwards. Sometimes things can be missed. If it's not there, definitely raise an issue on our Terraform provider repo, and the alerting team can work on getting that filled in, because it could be missing. Yeah.
That actually makes a really good plug for tomorrow. Funny enough, we have Grafana Campfire, which is also doing an alerting segment for an hour. So if you're along for that tomorrow, there hopefully should be one of the maintainers there that you can fire that question at again and hopefully get that sorted. So yeah, definitely speak to them as well. But thank you for answering that one, George. I wasn't sure if we
Yeah.
knew or not.
Yeah, so it's actually going to be one of our colleagues, Usman, who will be the developer advocate on that with a bunch of other cool folks from Grafana. And they're going to be focusing on Grafana alerting, whereas this one was really more focused on Loki and logs. But there's going to be some overlap. So there are some of these questions that might be better suited to that one. So catch that as well. I put it in the chat there, so you can do that. And it's going to be on Friday at well, just so that I don't have to do different time zone, just go to that video and you'll see it in your time zone. We are a little bit over already. Thank you, George, for staying a little bit longer with us.
George, thank you.
Yeah. And if there are any other questions, leave them in the comments and we'll try to answer them. If there's something that requires like, more information, more steps to reproduce or something like that, the community forum is better for that because then we can really get into what exactly you're doing and what exactly you're getting back. But more conceptual type stuff could also be answered here. I'll make sure we watch this. Thank you everybody for being here. There's a lot of questions.
Before we go, I have one more thing because we now actually have a schedule. Woohoo! So
Yay!
next month we have Poison coming back for Memcache. So if you have any questions about scaling Memcache with your Loki deployment or caching in general, come join us for that one. She's really excited to come back and join us. And then after that, it's going to be KubeCon, and we plan to do a special episode in person. So I finally get to see Nicole again there with Cyril, and we have a very exciting
Oh,
feature.
that's gonna be really cool.
Very
Yeah.
exciting feature coming to open source. So well, it is actually already available in the main branch. Just FYI, so if you can go digging for it, it's all in the open source, of course. But yeah, very special announcement in KubeCon. So looking forward to that.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming along, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks,
Bye,
squad.
everyone.
See you later.